Deepwater opens with an atmosphere that immediately feels different from a typical thriller because beneath the calm surface of an apparently comfortable marriage lies a dangerous game of suspicion, jealousy, manipulation, and psychological warfare. And at the center of this story is Vic Van Allen, a wealthy and intelligent man who lives with his wife Melinda in a beautiful Louisiana community where their privileged lifestyle appears peaceful from the outside, but behind closed doors, their relationship has become deeply complicated. Because Melinda openly maintains relationships with other men, while Vic remains strangely calm about it. And this unusual dynamic quickly becomes the central mystery of the movie, because most people would react with anger, confrontation, or separation. Yet Vic seems to accept the situation with an almost disturbing level of patience, and the more we observe him, the more difficult it becomes to understand what is happening inside his mind, because he is not simply a jealous husband trying to save a failing marriage. Instead, he appears to be watching Melinda, studying her behavior, and waiting for something, and this creates the psychological tension that drives the story forward, because the audience begins wondering whether Vic is genuinely comfortable with his wife's affairs or whether his calm behavior is hiding something much darker. And Melinda herself is a complicated character because she appears confident, intelligent, and socially powerful, yet there is also a sense that she is deliberately testing Vic's limits. And their relationship has become less about love and more about control, with both partners trying to determine who has the greater psychological advantage. And this is what makes Deepwater particularly unsettling, because the movie does not begin with an obvious villain and victim. Instead, it places two flawed people inside a toxic emotional relationship where both of them understand that they are playing a dangerous game. And the surrounding community becomes an important part of this world, because Vic and Melinda are constantly surrounded by friends, neighbors, business associates, and wealthy social circles, creating the appearance of normal family life, while rumors about Melinda's romantic relationships circulate quietly among everyone, and Vic's unusual reaction to these affairs becomes a subject of curiosity, because people cannot understand why a husband would tolerate his wife openly seeing other men, especially when the men are not simply secret lovers but people who become visible within their social circle. And Vic's behavior becomes even more mysterious when he seems to know exactly what is happening and yet refuses to respond in a conventional way. And instead of confronting Melinda directly, he maintains his composure, spends time with their young daughter, and continues living his life as though nothing unusual is happening. But this calmness creates an uncomfortable feeling because it seems almost too controlled, and the audience begins to sense that Vic may be capable of far more than he allows others to see. And his personality is essential to the movie because he is not portrayed as a stereotypical angry husband. He is intelligent, financially secure, technically skilled, and seemingly comfortable with solitude. And he has a quiet personality that makes it difficult for other people to know what he is thinking. And this becomes increasingly important because Melinda understands that Vic's calmness can be more frightening than anger, and she begins pushing his boundaries even further, almost as if she wants to provoke an emotional reaction from him. And the movie uses this relationship to explore the destructive nature of jealousy, obsession, and emotional manipulation, because Melinda's behavior can be interpreted as an attempt to regain excitement and control in a marriage that has become emotionally empty, while Vic's response can be interpreted as an attempt to regain power by refusing to react in the way she expects. And the result is a psychological battle where every conversation carries hidden meaning, every glance becomes suspicious, and every new person entering their lives creates another potential threat. And as the story continues, we learn more about Vic's background and his lifestyle, particularly his passion for technology and his work involving the development of microprocessors. And this technical side of his personality provides an interesting contrast with the emotional chaos happening inside his marriage, because Vic is someone who prefers systems, logic, and control, while his relationship with Melinda is unpredictable and emotionally complicated. And this contrast helps explain why he behaves the way he does, because he seems to believe that if he can remain calm enough, he can control the situation. But marriage cannot be controlled like a machine, and Melinda repeatedly proves that by introducing unpredictable elements into their lives. And one of those elements is her romantic relationships with other men, which become increasingly uncomfortable for Vic. And although he appears to tolerate them, the audience begins to wonder whether his patience has a limit. And this question becomes more important as one particular man becomes involved with Melinda. Because Vic's interactions with the people around her begin taking on a darker tone, and his words sometimes sound harmless on the surface but carry an unsettling implication underneath. And this is one of the movie's most effective techniques, because it rarely tells the audience exactly what Vic is thinking. Instead, it allows his behavior to create uncertainty. And uncertainty is what makes the story so tense, because when a character is openly angry, we understand what they might do. But when someone remains completely calm while facing something emotionally devastating, it becomes impossible to know what their next move will be. And Vic's silence, therefore, becomes a weapon. And Melinda begins to realize that she may not understand her husband as well as she thought she did. And this realization creates a subtle shift in their relationship, because the person who once seemed passive begins to appear increasingly dangerous, and the people around them begin noticing the strange tension between the couple, although most of them do not understand the true extent of what is happening. And among these people are Vic's friends and acquaintances, who provide different perspectives on the marriage and occasionally question why Vic allows Melinda so much freedom. And these conversations help establish the social environment around the couple, where appearances matter greatly, and people are quick to judge relationships based on what they see from the outside. But no one truly knows what happens between Vic and Melinda when they are alone. And this difference between public appearance and private reality becomes one of the central themes of the movie, because their home looks like a comfortable family environment, yet emotionally it is becoming a battlefield. And the tension grows because their daughter is also part of this environment, meaning that the consequences of their choices can affect more than just the two adults involved. And Vic's relationship with his daughter is one of the few areas where he appears genuinely gentle and protective, which makes his darker behavior even more complicated, because it shows that he is capable of love and care, even while participating in increasingly disturbing psychological games. And this prevents the character from being easily classified as either good or evil, because Vic is clearly flawed, but his motivations are complicated, and the movie deliberately keeps the audience questioning whether his actions are driven by jealousy, revenge, love, fear, or a desire to regain control over his life. And Melinda is equally difficult to categorize, because she can be charming and affectionate one moment and provocative and cruel the next. And her behavior suggests that she is not simply seeking physical relationships outside the marriage. She may also be trying to test whether Vic still cares about her. And this possibility makes the relationship even more tragic, because beneath the manipulation there may still be genuine emotional attachment. And this means that their marriage is not completely empty. Rather, it is filled with unresolved feelings that neither person knows how to express in a healthy way. And instead of communicating honestly, they communicate through games, jealousy, silence, and deliberate provocation. And as these games continue, the line between fantasy and reality becomes increasingly dangerous, because the consequences of their actions are no longer limited to hurt feelings. And the people entering Melinda's life may not understand the psychological environment they are stepping into. And this creates a sense of inevitability around the story, because once outsiders become involved in a deeply unstable relationship, someone is eventually going to get hurt. And the movie begins slowly building toward that point without immediately revealing exactly how it will happen. And Vic's calm behavior becomes more disturbing each time he interacts with one of Melinda's partners, because he does not act like someone who feels threatened. Instead, he sometimes behaves almost like a host, welcoming a guest into his own home. And this strange confidence raises a critical question. Why would Vic willingly spend time with men who are involved with his wife? The answer is not immediately clear, and the uncertainty is intentional, because Deepwater wants the audience to keep questioning Vic's true intentions, and this psychological mystery becomes the heart of the story. And as the social environment around the family becomes more complicated, rumors and assumptions begin spreading, and people start forming opinions about Vic and Melinda without understanding the full truth. And Vic's reputation as a quiet and successful man contrasts sharply with the rumors surrounding his marriage, making him an increasingly mysterious figure within the community, and the more people speculate about him, the more isolated he becomes, because very few people can actually understand what is happening behind the walls of his home. And this isolation also contributes to his psychological transformation, because he seems to retreat further into himself as Melinda continues testing him, and instead of openly expressing his pain, he begins turning that pain into something more controlled and calculated. And this is where the movie starts moving from a story about marital problems into a psychological thriller, because the question is no longer simply whether Vic and Melinda's marriage can survive. The question becomes whether their emotional games will eventually become deadly. And the movie's title, Deep Water, begins to feel symbolic because the characters are entering emotional territory where the surface may look calm while something dangerous is moving underneath. And Vic's personality perfectly represents this idea, because on the surface he appears calm, polite, and controlled. But beneath that calm exterior, there is clearly something much darker developing. And Melinda may believe she understands exactly how far she can push him, but the audience begins to suspect that she may have underestimated the person she lives with. And this uncertainty becomes more intense as Vic's actions begin attracting attention, and the men connected to Melinda do not necessarily understand the risks involved. Because they see Vic as an unusually accepting husband, perhaps even a weak one, but the movie gradually suggests that this interpretation could be completely wrong, and that misunderstanding becomes one of the most dangerous elements of the story. Because when people assume someone is harmless, they may behave carelessly around them, and Vic is the kind of character who benefits from being underestimated. And as the story progresses, his silence becomes more meaningful, his expressions become harder to read, and his interactions with Melinda become increasingly tense. And although they continue living together as a family, there is a growing emotional distance between them, and every attempt at normality feels artificial, because both of them know that their marriage is no longer functioning in a healthy way. Yet, neither seems willing to walk away completely, and this creates a strange cycle where they hurt each other and then continue returning to the same relationship. And the cycle is strengthened by their history together and their shared responsibilities, especially their daughter, who represents the life they built together and the part of their marriage that still connects them. And this makes separation more complicated, because leaving would mean accepting that the family they created is no longer what it once was. And Vic appears determined to preserve at least the appearance of that family, even as his relationship with Melinda deteriorates, while Melinda seems determined to continue pursuing excitement outside the marriage without fully giving up the security and emotional connection she receives from Vic. And this creates an unstable balance that cannot continue forever. And the arrival of new romantic interests threatens to destroy that balance, because every new person creates another opportunity for jealousy, confrontation, and manipulation. And Vic's increasingly strange behavior makes it clear that he is approaching a breaking point, even if he never openly says so. And this is where the movie's psychological tension becomes strongest, because the audience is forced to watch a man who appears calm, while wondering whether that calmness is actually the final stage before something terrible happens. And the movie does not rush to answer that question. Instead, it slowly builds pressure through conversations, social gatherings, family moments and private encounters, allowing the tension to accumulate naturally. And by the end of this first stage, it becomes clear that Vic and Melinda are trapped in a relationship where love, resentment, desire, jealousy, and control have become impossible to separate. And their marriage has transformed into a dangerous psychological game in which neither person is willing to surrender. And as Vic continues watching Melinda's actions with an unsettling calmness, the audience is left with one major question hanging over everything. How far will he go when he finally decides that enough is enough? As the story moves deeper into the troubled marriage between Vic and Melinda Van Allen, the strange balance between them begins to break apart, because what initially looks like an unusual arrangement between two adults gradually reveals itself as a dangerous psychological game in which both husband and wife are trying to control the emotional temperature of their relationship, and Vic's greatest advantage is his ability to remain calm. Because while Melinda expects jealousy, anger, or confrontation whenever she becomes involved with another man, Vic rarely gives her the reaction she wants, and this begins to frustrate her because she seems to need proof that he still cares. Yet Vic's silence gives her no clear answer, and instead of creating peace, his lack of reaction creates an even more uncomfortable atmosphere. Because Melinda begins wondering what he's thinking and whether his calmness is genuine or simply a disguise. And this uncertainty becomes increasingly dangerous when she introduces Joel Nash into their social circle, a young man who becomes romantically involved with her and quickly finds himself drawn into the strange world of the Van Allen marriage. And from Joel's perspective, Vic appears almost impossibly relaxed about the situation, because rather than confronting him, Vic welcomes him with a strange level of friendliness, and this behavior creates a false sense of security, making Joel believe that there is little risk in continuing his relationship with Melinda. But the audience has already learned enough about Vic to understand that his friendliness may not mean what it appears to mean. And every conversation between Vic and Joel therefore carries a hidden tension, because Vic knows exactly what Joel is doing with Melinda, while Joel does not understand how much Vic knows or what he might eventually do with that information. And this imbalance of knowledge gives Vic a psychological advantage because he can observe Joel without revealing his own intentions. And the more time Joel spends around Vic, the more uncomfortable the situation becomes, especially because Vic's behavior is so normal that it almost feels unnatural. And instead of treating Joel like a rival, he treats him like an acquaintance, inviting him into conversations and allowing him to remain around the family. And this makes the situation even more disturbing because it removes the normal boundaries that would usually exist between a husband and his wife's lover. And Melinda seems to enjoy this tension because she knows that Vic is aware of what is happening. Yet she continues testing him, almost as if she wants to force him into finally admitting that he is jealous. And this suggests that her affairs may not simply be about physical desire, because there is an emotional component to her behavior, a need to know that Vic still wants her, and perhaps even a desire to punish him for the emotional distance that has developed between them. But Vic responds in the opposite way, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. And this creates a cycle where Melinda pushes harder because Vic remains calm, while Vic becomes increasingly suspicious because Melinda continues pushing his boundaries. And the relationship slowly transforms into a battle of psychological endurance, with each person waiting for the other to break first. And the presence of their daughter Trixie makes the situation even more complicated, because despite their marital problems, both Vic and Melinda appear to care deeply about maintaining their family life. And Trixie provides moments of innocence that contrast sharply with the darkness developing between her parents. And Vic in particular seems protective of his daughter, which makes his private behavior even more difficult to understand, because he clearly understands that the choices he and Melinda are making could eventually affect their child. Yet, he continues participating in the game instead of simply ending the marriage. and this suggests that there are deeper emotional reasons keeping him attached to Melinda. Perhaps love, perhaps obsession, perhaps the belief that their marriage can still be repaired, or perhaps a desire to maintain control over the life they built together. And the movie deliberately avoids giving one simple answer because Vic himself seems uncertain about what he truly wants. And this ambiguity makes his character more realistic and disturbing at the same time because he is not acting according to a clear moral code. He is reacting emotionally while pretending to remain completely rational. And as Joel becomes more involved with Melinda, the tension between him and Vic increases. But Joel still does not understand the seriousness of the situation because he sees Melinda as an exciting woman trapped in a boring marriage and assumes that Vic is simply the passive husband who allows her freedom. And this assumption becomes dangerous because it encourages Joel to behave more confidently than he otherwise might. And Vic notices this confidence, but rather than confronting Joel directly, he allows him to continue. And this creates the feeling that Vic may be waiting for something, and the audience begins to wonder whether his patience is actually a carefully calculated strategy. Because Vic is intelligent enough to understand that an emotional confrontation would create problems, while quiet observation gives him more information. And his technical mind also contributes to this impression because he approaches problems almost like systems that can be analyzed and controlled. But human relationships do not operate according to predictable rules, and Melinda repeatedly proves this by making choices that Vic cannot completely anticipate. And this inability to control her becomes one of the things that frustrates him most because Vic has built a comfortable life where almost everything appears organized. His home is beautiful, his financial situation is secure, his professional life is successful, and his relationship with his daughter provides emotional stability. But Melinda represents the one part of his world that refuses to behave according to his expectations. And this may explain why he becomes so obsessed with understanding her behavior. Because losing control over the marriage feels like losing control over the entire structure of his life. And Melinda seems to recognize this vulnerability, which is why she continues challenging him. And the more she tests him, the more difficult it becomes for Vic to maintain his emotional distance. And eventually, the consequences of their behavior begin reaching beyond the marriage because other people become involved and rumors start circulating through their social circle. And the Van Allen marriage becomes a subject of quiet speculation, with people wondering how Vic can tolerate Melinda's affairs and why he does not simply leave her. And Vic's unusual behavior becomes part of his public image, creating a strange contrast between the respected businessman people know and the mysterious husband they cannot understand. And this social pressure adds another layer to the story because Vic and Melinda are not living in isolation. They are constantly surrounded by people who observe them and form opinions about them. And in such an environment, secrets become difficult to maintain, and the more visible Melinda's relationships become, the more difficult it becomes for Vic to pretend that everything is normal. Yet he continues doing exactly that, and this makes the audience question whether he is protecting himself or preparing for something. And the arrival of another man into Melinda's life further increases the tension because each new relationship forces Vic to confront the same problem again. And rather than becoming more emotional, he appears to become more detached, which ironically makes him seem more dangerous. Because emotional people are often predictable, while calm people can be difficult to read, and Vic's unreadable personality becomes a constant source of suspense, especially when he interacts with Melinda's partners, because there is always the possibility that a seemingly innocent conversation may have a darker meaning. And this is where the film begins using its title metaphorically, because the characters are entering deep emotional water where they can no longer see the bottom, and every step they take makes it harder to return to safety. And Melinda seems increasingly willing to take risks, while Vic becomes increasingly willing to let her take those risks. and this combination creates a dangerous situation because neither person is acting responsibly. And the men involved with Melinda are especially vulnerable because they do not fully understand the history or emotional complexity of the marriage, and they often assume that Vic is simply an unusual husband rather than someone who could potentially become a threat. And this misunderstanding becomes one of the central sources of suspense because the audience knows that Vic's calm exterior is hiding intense emotions, even if those emotions have not yet exploded. And the more he watches, the more the possibility of violence begins hanging over the story. And when a tragic event occurs involving one of Melinda's lovers, the atmosphere changes completely because what had previously been an uncomfortable game suddenly begins to feel like something much more dangerous. And suspicion naturally falls on Vic because of the strange circumstances and his unusual behavior. But proving that Vic is responsible is another matter entirely, and this uncertainty becomes the foundation of the next stage of the story. Because Vic understands that people are beginning to look at him differently, while Melinda herself begins wondering whether her husband may be capable of things she never imagined. And the psychological balance between them starts shifting, because now the possibility of real danger has entered their marriage and Vic no longer seems like a passive observer. He appears capable of becoming an active participant in the destruction of the people around Melinda, and yet he continues behaving calmly, which makes the situation even more disturbing. Because if he were openly violent, the audience would know what to expect. But his ability to move through social situations without revealing his emotions makes it impossible to predict what he will do next. And Melinda begins to realize that she may have created a situation she can no longer control. Because the games she once used to provoke Vic have produced consequences that cannot simply be reversed, and she now has to consider whether the man she lives with is actually the man she believed him to be. And this realization creates a new form of fear inside their marriage because trust has already disappeared, and without trust, every action can be interpreted as a threat, and every moment of silence can feel like a warning. And as Vic's reputation begins changing, the people around him also start questioning what they know about him, because the quiet and successful husband now appears connected to something much darker. And the police and community begin paying closer attention to the circumstances surrounding the tragedy, creating pressure that could eventually expose the truth. But Vic remains remarkably composed, and this composure becomes one of his strongest defenses because he does not behave like someone who is panicking, and instead he continues living his life almost normally, spending time with Trixie and maintaining his professional activities, while Melinda becomes increasingly uncertain about what is happening. And this contrast between Vic's calmness and Melinda's growing anxiety makes their relationship even more psychologically intense because Melinda begins losing the emotional control she once believed she possessed, and Vic appears to be gaining it. And this reversal is important because the entire marriage has been built around Melinda testing Vic's limits. But now Vic is the one controlling the uncertainty, and Melinda no longer knows what he might do. And the audience is placed in the same position because the movie refuses to reveal all of Vic's intentions, allowing suspicion to grow naturally. And this makes every new scene feel potentially dangerous, especially when Vic and Melinda are alone together because their conversations are filled with unspoken accusations and hidden threats. And although they continue acting like a married couple in public, privately their relationship has become almost impossible to recognize. And the question of whether they still love each other becomes less important than the question of whether either of them can escape the cycle they have created. And this is where the movie's psychological themes become increasingly clear. Because jealousy can become a form of control, love can become obsession, and silence can become a weapon. And Vic's silence is particularly powerful because it forces Melinda to fill the empty spaces with her own fears. and the more she imagines what he might be thinking, the more frightened she becomes. And this is one of the film's most effective ideas, because sometimes the possibility of danger is more powerful than visible danger itself. And Vic's presence begins carrying that possibility everywhere he goes. And as the story moves forward, the community around the Van Allens becomes increasingly suspicious, and the police begin looking more closely at the circumstances surrounding the death of Melinda's lover. While Vic remains difficult to read, and his behavior can be interpreted in multiple ways, which makes the investigation complicated because there is no simple piece of evidence that completely explains what happened. And Vic's ability to remain composed under pressure allows him to continue denying any wrongdoing, while Melinda becomes caught between fear and curiosity, because part of her wants to believe that Vic could never cross that line, while another part of her begins to suspect that she may have underestimated him. And this internal conflict becomes one of the most important parts of her character development, because she is forced to confront the consequences of the emotional games she has been playing. And for the first time, the possibility that Vic could actually be dangerous changes the way she sees him, and the man she once considered emotionally passive now appears unpredictable. And this makes her own behavior more cautious, but it also makes her more emotionally attached to him in a complicated way, because fear and fascination begin becoming mixed together. And the movie uses this tension to explore the strange relationship between love and danger, showing how people can remain emotionally connected to someone even when they no longer feel completely safe around them. And Vic's relationship with Melinda therefore becomes increasingly difficult to define, because they are simultaneously husband and wife, enemies, partners, parents, and psychological opponents, and every one of these roles affects the others. And as part 2 comes to its conclusion, the situation has moved far beyond the original problem of an unhappy marriage, because now there is suspicion of murder, a growing investigation, increasing fear, and a husband whose calmness has become more frightening than his anger ever could have been. And Melinda finally begins to understand that the game she started may have changed the rules completely, because Vic is no longer simply watching her choices. He may now be deciding what happens next. And as the pressure closes around them, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If Vic really is responsible for what happened to the men in Melinda's life, how far is he willing to go? And what will happen when someone finally decides to challenge him? As the tension surrounding Vic and Melinda continues to rise, their marriage begins transforming from a private emotional struggle into a dangerous situation that attracts the attention of the people around them. Because after the disappearance and death of men connected to Melinda, Vic's strange behavior becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. And although there is no simple proof connecting him directly to the deaths, the circumstances are suspicious enough to make everyone wonder whether the seemingly calm husband is actually responsible. And Vic understands that people are beginning to watch him more carefully. But instead of becoming nervous, he continues behaving with the same quiet confidence that has defined him from the beginning. And this makes the situation even more unsettling, because it suggests that Vic may not be afraid of suspicion. And perhaps he believes that suspicion alone will never be enough to prove anything. And this confidence begins affecting Melinda, because she can no longer look at her husband in the same way. And the man she once considered predictable now seems capable of almost anything. Yet, despite her growing fear, Melinda continues to remain emotionally connected to him, and this contradiction becomes one of the most fascinating elements of the relationship, because she appears to be both frightened by Vic and fascinated by the possibility that he may actually be more powerful and dangerous than she ever imagined. And instead of immediately leaving him, she begins watching him more closely, trying to determine whether the rumors and suspicions surrounding him are true. And Vic seems to notice this change in her behavior, but he does not directly confront her, allowing the uncertainty to grow between them. And this creates a strange psychological battle in which both characters are studying one another while pretending that everything is normal. And the tension becomes even stronger when another man enters Melinda's world, because each new relationship represents another potential threat to the fragile balance inside the Van Allen household. And Vic's reaction remains almost impossible to predict, because rather than behaving like a jealous husband, he continues to act as though he has nothing to fear. And this unusual behavior makes the other men underestimate him, which may be exactly what Vic wants. Because when people believe someone is harmless, they become careless around that person. And Vic's intelligence allows him to take advantage of that assumption. And this is where the story becomes increasingly psychological rather than simply romantic or criminal, because the real question is no longer whether Melinda is being unfaithful. Everyone already knows that she is. The real question is what Vic intends to do about it, and whether his apparent acceptance of the situation is genuine or part of a much larger plan. And as Vic continues observing Melinda and the men around her, the audience begins to understand that he may be using silence and uncertainty as weapons, because he rarely tells people what he is thinking, and that forces them to imagine the worst possibilities themselves. And in a strange way, this makes Vic more powerful than if he simply threatens someone directly, because a direct threat can be challenged, but uncertainty cannot. And Melinda begins feeling the psychological pressure of this uncertainty more intensely than anyone else, because she knows Vic better than the others do, and she knows that his calm personality hides a complicated emotional world, and she begins wondering whether the man she married has always possessed a darker side, or whether the circumstances of their marriage have slowly created it. And this question becomes especially important because Vic's relationship with Melinda was never simply based on jealousy. Their marriage contains genuine affection, shared memories, family responsibilities, and a complicated emotional bond that neither of them seems willing to abandon. And this makes the situation tragic, because neither person is completely willing to walk away, even though remaining together may be destroying both of them. And their daughter Trixie becomes an important reminder of the family they are trying to preserve, because Vic clearly cares about his daughter and wants to provide her with stability, while Melinda also wants to maintain the appearance of a functioning family. And this creates another reason why they continue living together despite everything happening between them. And the home therefore becomes a strange mixture of family warmth and psychological danger, with ordinary moments taking place alongside conversations filled with hidden accusations. And Trixie's presence sometimes creates temporary moments of normality, but the tension between her parents never completely disappears, and the audience can feel that something is wrong even when nothing openly dramatic is happening. And this slow building tension is one of the movie's defining characteristics, because Deep Water does not depend entirely on constant action. Instead, it allows suspicion to grow through conversations, glances, social gatherings, and subtle changes in behavior. And this approach makes the characters feel increasingly trapped inside their own decisions, because every new choice creates another consequence, and every consequence makes it harder to return to the way things were before. And as more people begin discussing the deaths connected to Melinda, Vic becomes increasingly isolated, because even his friends start questioning what kind of person he really is. And one of the most important relationships affected by this suspicion is his friendship with Don Wilson, a man who has known Vic for years and initially sees him as a harmless and intelligent friend. But as the circumstances become more suspicious, Don begins wondering whether there may be more to Vic than he previously understood. And this creates another layer of tension because Vic's closest relationships are now being affected by the rumors surrounding him. And Don's observations also provide the audience with an outside perspective on Vic, because unlike Melinda, who is emotionally involved with him, Don can look at the situation from a more detached position, and what he sees increasingly worries him. especially because Big does not seem particularly concerned about the possibility that people suspect him. And this unusual confidence makes Dawn wonder whether Big knows something everyone else does not. And the more Dawn investigates the situation, the more uncomfortable the friendship becomes, because Big senses that Dawn is questioning him, while Dawn realizes that asking too many questions could potentially make him a target. And this creates an atmosphere in which even friendship feels dangerous. And meanwhile, Melinda continues her complicated behavior, but her attitude toward Vic begins changing, because she now understands that he may not simply be tolerating her affairs, he may be using them as part of some psychological game. And this realization forces her to reconsider the meaning of his previous behavior. Because moments she once interpreted as weakness can now be interpreted as confidence, and moments she believed were signs of indifference can now appear like carefully controlled anger. And this shift in perception completely changes the power dynamic between them, because Melinda begins realizing that Vic may have been watching her all along, and that he may know more about her relationships than she ever realized, and the thought that Vic could have been quietly observing everything makes her uncomfortable. But it also creates a strange fascination, because she begins seeing a side of him that she may never have encountered before. And this is where the movie's psychological complexity becomes particularly strong, because Melinda's attraction to danger begins mixing with her fear of it, and the person she once tried to provoke may now be the person she cannot predict. And Vic, meanwhile, seems increasingly comfortable with this new dynamic, because for the first time, Melinda is no longer completely in control of the relationship. And the more uncertain she becomes, the more power he appears to gain. And this is a reversal of the original situation, because at the beginning, Melinda controlled the emotional tension by openly seeing other men, while Vic remained passive. But now, Vic controls the emotional tension simply by refusing to reveal what he knows or what he intends to do. And the result is a relationship where both characters are constantly testing one another, without ever openly declaring the rules of the game. And as the investigation surrounding the deaths develops, the authorities begin examining the circumstances more carefully. But Vic remains difficult to connect directly to the crimes, because his behavior is suspicious without necessarily providing concrete evidence. And this allows him to continue living his life while suspicion grows around him. And the lack of definitive proof becomes an important source of frustration for those who suspect him, because everyone may have an opinion about Vic, but an opinion is not enough to establish guilt, and Vic seems to understand this perfectly, which makes him even more difficult to challenge, and his calm attitude under pressure becomes almost like armor, protecting him from the emotional reactions that could otherwise expose him. And yet, the audience can sense that beneath this calm exterior, there is still intense emotional conflict, because Vic is not completely detached from Melinda, and his feelings toward her remain complicated, and this is why his actions cannot simply be understood as cold revenge, because there are moments when he seems genuinely hurt by her behavior, and there are other moments when he appears almost amused by the situation, suggesting that his emotions are constantly shifting. And this unpredictability makes him dangerous, because even Vic may not fully understand where his own emotional limits are. And the movie uses this uncertainty to create suspense, because the audience is forced to keep asking whether Vic is controlling the situation or slowly losing control of himself. And this question becomes increasingly important as the relationship with Melinda continues deteriorating, because the more she tests him, the more extreme the consequences become, and at the same time, the more Vic refuses to react openly, the more Melinda feels compelled to push him further, creating a destructive cycle that neither person seems capable of stopping. And this cycle is made even more dangerous by the presence of outsiders who do not understand the emotional history between them, because the men involved with Melinda often enter the relationship believing they are simply having an affair with an unhappy married woman, but they do not understand that they are stepping into a psychological conflict that has been developing for years, and Vic's strange willingness to interact with them only makes their misunderstanding worse, because they see him as harmless and perhaps even pathetic, while the audience increasingly suspects that he may be the most dangerous person in the room. And this difference between appearance and reality becomes one of the film's most important themes, because almost every character is hiding something, and the people who appear confident may be afraid, while the people who appear harmless may be capable of violence. And the deeper the story goes, the harder it becomes to determine who is actually in control. And Melinda begins realizing that she may have helped create the very situation she now fears, because by repeatedly provoking Vic and bringing other men into their marriage, she has pushed him into a psychological corner. But at the same time, Vic is responsible for his own choices, and his actions cannot simply be blamed on Melinda because he has chosen to respond through secrecy and manipulation rather than honest communication. And this makes the relationship a tragic example of two people who are both contributing to their own destruction, and instead of confronting the problems in their marriage directly, they continue using other people and emotional games to communicate, and every new relationship becomes another weapon in their struggle for control. And as the story progresses, Vic's reputation becomes increasingly complicated because some people begin to believe that he is responsible for the deaths, while others cannot imagine the quiet family men they know committing such crimes. And this division creates a cloud of uncertainty around him, and Vic seems almost to benefit from that uncertainty because as long as people disagree about him, no one can confidently act against him. And this allows him to continue moving through his community without revealing what he really knows. And his interactions with Dan become particularly important because Dan is one of the few people willing to challenge Vic directly. And this creates tension between them that eventually threatens to destroy their friendship. Because Vic does not appreciate being questioned, while Don does not feel comfortable ignoring what he sees. And their conflict demonstrates how suspicion can destroy relationships even when there is no definitive proof. And meanwhile, Melinda's feelings toward Vic continue becoming more complicated, because the possibility that he may be dangerous changes the emotional balance between them, and she begins seeing him not simply as a husband she has emotionally escaped from, but as a man who may still possess a powerful hold over her. And this creates an unexpected attraction because fear and fascination begin becoming connected. And the movie explores how dangerous relationships can sometimes become emotionally addictive, especially when both people are constantly trying to understand and control one another. And Vic's ability to remain calm becomes increasingly seductive to Melinda because it represents something she has not seen in him before, a sense of confidence and power. And this creates a disturbing possibility that the very darkness she fears may also be part of what draws her back toward him. And as the relationship becomes more complicated, the boundaries between love, jealousy, revenge, and desire begin disappearing. And the audience is left questioning whether these two people actually want to escape one another or whether they are emotionally dependent on the conflict itself. Because without the jealousy and danger, they may not know how to connect anymore, and this is perhaps the saddest part of the relationship, because the emotional intensity that once brought them together has become the same force destroying them. And as the pressure continues building, Vic and Melinda move closer to a point where someone will eventually have to make a final choice. And the investigation, the rumors, the affairs, and the psychological games are all moving toward a confrontation that cannot be avoided forever. And by the end of this stage, Vic's calm exterior no longer feels reassuring. It feels like a warning, because the audience understands that he has reached the point where his next decision could completely change the future of everyone around him, while Melinda is beginning to realize that she may have awakened a side of her husband that she can no longer control. And with the people around them becoming increasingly suspicious and the possibility of another tragedy hanging over the family, the question is no longer whether the marriage can return to normal, because normality has already disappeared. The real question is whether Vic and Melinda can survive the dangerous game they created together before it finally consumes them both. The situation between Vic and Melinda now becomes far more dangerous because the rumors surrounding Vic's strange confession about Martin McRae have begun spreading through their social circle, and what initially appeared to be a disturbing joke is slowly changing the way people see him, especially Don Wilson, a writer who becomes increasingly convinced that there may be something darker behind Vic's calm personality. While Vic himself seems to enjoy the fear his story creates, because for the first time he has discovered that he can affect Melinda's lovers simply by making them believe that he is capable of murder. And this gives him a strange sense of control that he has been missing from his marriage. But the illusion does not last forever, because the truth about Martin eventually comes out when the police identify the real killer, proving that Vic was lying when he claimed responsibility for Martin's death. And instead of ending the tension, this revelation actually creates a new problem for Vic because his imaginary power disappears and Melinda is free once again to continue seeing other men. And Vic realizes that his previous confession had given him something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of control over the chaos surrounding his marriage. And when that control disappears, his jealousy becomes more difficult to contain, especially after Melinda begins seeing Charlie DeLisle, a young piano teacher who represents another threat to Vic's fragile relationship with his wife. And Vic discovers that Melinda has given Charlie a significant amount of money, which makes him suspicious that their relationship is becoming more serious. And instead of simply accepting it, Vic begins following Charlie and watching his movements, trying to understand exactly what Melinda sees in him. And this is a major turning point because Vic's behavior is no longer limited to emotional jealousy. He is actively monitoring the man who has entered his wife's life. And Melinda seems to understand exactly what she's doing because she continues bringing Charlie closer to the family and even invites him to social events where Vic is present, almost as if she wants to force Vic to confront his feelings. And the more Vic watches Melinda and Charlie together, the more difficult it becomes for him to maintain his previous indifference. And at a pool party hosted by their friends, the tension finally reaches another level, because Melinda openly enjoys Charlie's company while Vic watches from a distance. And when the weather suddenly changes and everyone leaves the pool area, Vic and Charlie are left alone, creating a moment where the psychological tension between them becomes almost unbearable, and Charlie does not fully understand how dangerous the situation has become, because he sees Vic as the quiet husband who has somehow accepted the arrangement. But Vic's behavior suggests something very different, and when Charlie's body is later discovered in the pool, the entire atmosphere changes immediately, because what was previously an uncomfortable marriage has now become a possible murder investigation. And the fact that Vic was alone with Charlie before his death naturally raises suspicion, especially because Vic had already told people that he was capable of killing Melinda's lovers. And Melinda is quick to turn that suspicion toward her husband, suggesting that Vic may have finally acted on the threat he had been making. And Vic's response is chilling because he does not simply deny everything with panic. Instead, he maintains his composure and even asks Melinda whether she is afraid of him. And her answer reveals just how complicated their relationship has become, because she suggests that she is not afraid in the way Vic expects, implying that if he really killed Charlie, then perhaps he did it because of his feelings for her. And this creates a strange emotional connection between violence and love, because Melinda begins interpreting Vic's potential crimes as proof that he still cares about her. And rather than immediately ending the relationship, she becomes more fascinated by the possibility that the quiet man she married may finally be revealing his true nature. While Vic himself appears to enjoy the uncertainty because he knows that no one can prove exactly what happened. And this creates a dangerous psychological advantage, because the suspicion surrounding him is now strong enough to frighten people even without direct evidence. and Don Wilson becomes increasingly determined to uncover the truth because, unlike many of their friends, Don does not treat Vic's behavior as a joke, and he begins believing that the deaths of Melinda's lovers may not be coincidences, and his suspicion eventually becomes serious enough that he and Melinda arrange for a private investigator to keep an eye on Vic, hoping to discover evidence that could connect him to Charlie's death. But Vic is more observant than they expect, and he soon realizes that someone is following him. And when he discovers what Don and Melinda have been doing, he confronts Don directly, forcing their suspicion into the open. And this confrontation demonstrates just how much the balance of power has changed, because Vic is no longer simply reacting to other people's accusations, he is actively challenging the people who are investigating him. And his confidence makes Don even more suspicious, because an innocent man might normally be frightened or defensive, while Vic seems almost amused by the accusations. And this makes Don believe that there must be something hidden beneath Vic's calm exterior. And Melinda becomes caught between the two men because she wants to understand whether Vic is truly responsible for Charlie's death, but she also seems fascinated by the possibility that he might be. And this emotional conflict becomes increasingly important because Melinda's attitude toward Vic begins changing, and the more dangerous he appears, the more intensely she seems drawn toward him, creating a strange reversal in their marriage. Because at the beginning, Melinda was the one controlling the relationship through her affairs, while Vic remained passive. But now, Vic's potential violence has changed the emotional balance, and Melinda is beginning to see him as a man with power rather than simply a husband who tolerates her behavior. And this shift becomes even more complicated when Melinda reconnects with Tony Cameron, an old boyfriend who represents a completely different kind of threat, because Tony is not simply another temporary lover, he is someone from Melinda's past who appears capable of offering her a new future. And Vic overhears conversations suggesting that Melinda and Tony may leave together and move to Brazil, taking Trixie with them. And this possibility becomes the breaking point for Vic, because until now he could tolerate Melinda's affairs as long as she remained part of the family. But the idea of losing his wife and daughter completely is something he cannot accept. And suddenly the stakes are no longer about jealousy alone. They are about losing the life he has built. And Vic's response is quiet but terrifying, because instead of confronting Tony publicly, he waits for the right opportunity. And eventually he offers Tony a ride, taking him away from the safety of the town and toward a secluded location connected to Vic and Melinda's past, a place where they once spent time together before their marriage became so damaged. And this location carries symbolic importance because Vic is essentially bringing Tony into the memory of the relationship he believes Tony is trying to destroy. And the confrontation becomes violent when Vic attacks Tony and causes him to fall to his death. And afterward, Vic attempts to hide the body in the nearby water, carefully trying to remove evidence of what he has done. And this moment confirms what the audience has been suspecting, because Vic has now crossed the line from threatening people with imaginary stories to actually killing one of Melinda's lovers. And the transformation is significant because Vic no longer needs the fantasy of being dangerous. He has become dangerous. And yet the strangest part is that he remains calm afterward, returning to his family as though he has simply completed another difficult task. And this suggests that the murder has not broken him emotionally in the way one might expect. Instead, it appears to give him an even stronger sense of control. And when Melinda later plans a picnic with Vic and Trixie at the same location where Tony's body has been hidden, Vic is forced to confront the possibility that his secret may be discovered, because the body has not been concealed as well as he hoped, and he notices signs that Tony's remains may become visible, creating an enormous risk. Yet rather than panicking, Vic continues behaving normally during the family picnic, giving Melinda a collection of photographs he has secretly taken of her. And these photographs reveal another side of his personality, because they show how closely he has been watching her, not simply as a jealous husband, but as someone deeply obsessed with preserving his relationship with her. and he presents the photographs almost as proof of his love, which makes the moment emotionally complicated because his affection and possessiveness have become almost impossible to separate. And Melinda seems affected by the gesture because she realizes that Vic has been paying far more attention to her than she thought. And for a brief moment, the two appear almost like a normal couple again. But the hidden body nearby makes the peaceful scene deeply disturbing, because the audience knows that Vic's secret is physically close to them, even while the family is enjoying a picnic. And this contrast between domestic happiness and hidden violence perfectly captures the central idea of deep water, that beneath the surface of an ordinary family life, there can be something much darker. And when they return home, Vic understands that he must eventually deal with Tony's body before someone discovers it, and he creates an excuse to return to the location, suggesting that Melinda lost a scarf and that he will retrieve it. But Melinda is already suspicious, and she informs Dawn about the situation, creating another layer of danger because Dawn has been waiting for an opportunity to prove his suspicions. And yet, despite everything that has happened, Melinda still chooses to spend the night with Vic, and this decision reveals how complicated her feelings have become, because she may now believe that Vic really did kill for her, and instead of being completely repulsed, part of her seems to interpret his violence as proof that he still loves her. And this is perhaps the most disturbing development in their relationship, because the marriage that once seemed emotionally empty is suddenly filled with an intense connection created through fear, jealousy, and danger. And Vic appears to sense this change as well, because he no longer has to chase Melinda's attention. She is beginning to move toward him on her own, and this gives him a sense of victory. But the victory is fragile because Dawn is still watching, and the evidence surrounding Tony's disappearance is becoming more dangerous. And when Vic returns to the creek to deal with the body, he is suddenly confronted by Dawn, who finally sees enough to understand that his suspicions were correct. And Dawn's discovery changes everything, because for the first time, there is someone who has direct knowledge of what Vic has done. And Vic realizes that the situation has become extremely dangerous, because Dawn can now go directly to the authorities and expose him. And Dawn immediately attempts to escape and alert the police, while Vic follows him, desperate to prevent him from reaching help, and the pursuit becomes chaotic as Vic uses his bicycle to chase Dawn through the surrounding area, trying to intercept him before he can reach the authorities. And Dawn, terrified and distracted, drives recklessly while attempting to escape, and the situation spirals out of control until a sudden accident changes everything, and Dawn's car crashes after swerving to avoid Vic, resulting in his death. And although Vic did not directly kill Dawn in the same way he killed Tony, his actions and pursuit contributed to the chain of events that caused the fatal accident, leaving another death connected to his increasingly dangerous behavior. And this moment is especially important because it demonstrates that Vic's actions are beginning to create consequences that he cannot fully control. And even though he may believe that he can manage every situation through intelligence and calmness, reality is becoming increasingly unpredictable. And meanwhile, back at the Van Allen home, Melinda discovers something that may finally confirm her suspicions, because she finds Tony's wallet and identification hidden among Vic's snail collection, and the discovery gives her physical evidence that connects Vic directly to Tony's disappearance. And suddenly, the question that has haunted her throughout the story has an answer. Vic really is capable of killing the men in her life, and this revelation should be the moment when Melinda leaves him. But instead, her reaction is far more complicated, because she begins packing a suitcase and appears ready to leave with Trixie. Yet Trixie refuses to accept the idea of leaving her father, and this creates another emotional conflict because their daughter has formed a strong bond with Vic and sees him as the stable parent in the family. And her resistance forces Melinda to reconsider her decision. And when Vic eventually returns home, he finds Melinda waiting for him, and she tells him that she saw Tony, a statement that carries enormous meaning because both of them understand what she really means, and Vic realizes that Melinda knows what he has done. Yet instead of calling the police or immediately confronting him, she makes another surprising choice. And this choice leads the story toward its final stage, because Melinda takes Tony's identification and burns it, effectively destroying evidence that could connect Vic to the missing man. And this act suggests that despite everything she has discovered, she may be choosing to remain with Vic rather than expose him. And this is where the movie's central psychological relationship reaches its strangest point. Because Melinda once seemed desperate to escape the emotional emptiness of her marriage, yet now that she has discovered the darker side of her husband, she appears more emotionally connected to him than ever. And Vic, meanwhile, has finally achieved something he could never obtain through arguments or jealousy. He has become impossible for Melinda to ignore, and the relationship has transformed into something darker but also more intimate, because both characters now understand the truth about one another. And the final question is no longer whether Vic loves Melinda, because his actions have made his obsession clear. The real question is whether Melinda can accept the kind of love he is offering. And as the story moves toward its conclusion, the answer appears increasingly complicated, because she has the opportunity to expose him but chooses not to, suggesting that the emotional bond between them has become stronger than the fear that should separate them. And this creates the unsettling ending that defines Deep Water, where the family that appeared to be falling apart may actually remain together, but not because the problems have been solved, rather because both husband and wife have finally accepted the darker reality of their relationship. And as the final moments approach, the calm surface of their lives returns. But now the audience understands what lies beneath it, because Vic is no longer simply a jealous husband. Melinda is no longer simply an unfaithful wife, and their marriage is no longer merely unhappy. It has become a dangerous partnership built around secrets, violence, obsession, and an emotional connection neither of them seems willing to abandon. After Melinda discovers Tony's identification among Vic's belongings, the entire meaning of their marriage changes, because until this point she has been living with suspicion, but now she has something much closer to certainty, and instead of immediately exposing Vic, Melinda makes the shocking decision to protect him by destroying the evidence, which reveals that the relationship between them has reached a place where ordinary ideas of love, trust, and morality no longer apply, because Melinda may have spent years trying to make Vic jealous, but now she has discovered that his jealousy can become deadly, and rather than running away completely, she seems strangely drawn toward the darker version of her husband, perhaps because for the first time she feels completely certain that he wants her. And this realization changes the emotional balance between them, because Melinda no longer has to wonder whether Vic cares about her. His actions have answered that question in the most disturbing possible way. And Vic, meanwhile, understands that Melinda knows his secret. Yet he does not seem frightened by her discovery, because he can see that she has chosen not to expose him, and this creates a new kind of bond between them, one based not on honesty but on shared knowledge. And the two of them now understand that their marriage contains something far darker than either of them had previously admitted. And this is where the movie's central idea becomes clearest, because the surface of the relationship may look calm again, but underneath that calmness there is an enormous amount of danger. And the title, Deep Water, becomes almost a perfect metaphor for their marriage, because from the outside everything can appear peaceful, but beneath the surface there are secrets, resentment, jealousy, fear, desire, and violence. And once the characters enter that deeper emotional space, there is no easy way back to normality. And Melinda's decision to burn Tony's identification is especially important because she is not simply hiding evidence for Vic. She is also making a choice about the future of their family because she knows that exposing Vic will destroy the household and potentially separate her from Trixie, and her daughter's attachment to Vic has already shown that the situation is more complicated than a simple husband versus wife conflict because Trixie genuinely loves her father and sees him as a caring and protective parent, and Melinda understands that whatever Vic may have done, he is still the father of their child, and this creates a moral conflict that she cannot easily resolve. And at the same time, Melinda has to confront her own role in the events that have taken place, because although she did not directly cause the deaths of her lovers, she repeatedly brought new men into a marriage that was already emotionally unstable, and she used those relationships to provoke Vic, sometimes almost deliberately testing how much he would tolerate. And now she has discovered the answer, and the answer is more frightening than she expected. Because Vic's patience was never necessarily weakness. It may have been the patience of someone waiting until he believed he had no other choice. And this does not excuse his actions, but it helps explain why the psychological dynamic between them became so destructive. And Vic himself has also crossed a point of no return, because once he has killed Tony and become indirectly responsible for Don's death, he can no longer return to the identity of the quiet businessman who simply tolerated his wife's affairs, and the version of Vic that Melinda knew before is effectively gone, replaced by a man who has discovered that violence can give him control. And this is one of the most disturbing aspects of his character development, because he does not appear to experience the same level of emotional collapse that might be expected after committing such acts. Instead, he continues behaving calmly, caring for Trixie, maintaining his home, and interacting with Melinda as though he has simply solved a problem. And this suggests that Vic's greatest danger is not uncontrolled rage, but controlled obsession, because he does not need to shout or threaten people openly. He can make decisions quietly and then continue living his life. And this makes him much harder to predict, and Melinda begins to understand that she is now living with someone whose emotional limits are completely different from her own. Yet, rather than distancing herself, she seems to accept this new reality, and this acceptance is what makes the ending so unsettling, because the movie does not give us a traditional punishment or redemption story. Instead, it shows two people finding a strange form of stability after passing through something deeply destructive. And that stability is not healthy, but it is real. And the relationship between Vic and Melinda becomes almost like a secret pact, because both know the truth and both have reasons to remain silent. And this shared secret gives their marriage a new kind of intimacy, because they no longer have to pretend that everything is normal, at least not with each other. And the irony is that the violence may have accomplished something that years of communication never could. It has forced them to acknowledge the intensity of their feelings, even though those feelings have become mixed with fear and control. And this makes the movie less about solving a murder mystery and more about exploring why two people remain connected even after their relationship becomes deeply unhealthy. And Melinda's decision to protect Vic can therefore be interpreted in several ways, because she may still love him, she may feel responsible for what happened, she may fear losing her family, or she may simply recognize that the dangerous side of Vic is exactly the side that proves how deeply he cares about her. And the film deliberately leaves room for all of these interpretations, because Melinda herself may not fully understand her motivations. And Vic is equally complicated, because his actions are clearly driven by jealousy, but they are also driven by his desire to preserve his family, and he seems convinced that removing the men threatening his marriage will somehow restore the relationship he wants, even though this logic is fundamentally destructive. And this is where the movie becomes a study of obsession, because Vic's idea of love has become inseparable from possession, and Melinda's idea of freedom has become inseparable from provoking him, and both characters are trapped inside the same cycle. And the tragedy is that they may actually care about one another, but they have lost the ability to express that care in a healthy way. And as the relationship settles into this strange new balance, the outside world continues moving forward, but the people around them do not fully understand what has happened. Because from their perspective, the Van Allens are still a wealthy couple living a comfortable life, and the family appears to have survived another crisis. But the audience knows that their apparent peace has been built on secrets and death, and this creates a powerful contrast between appearance and reality, because the same beautiful home that once represented comfort now feels like a place where dangerous secrets are being protected. And Vic's quiet personality becomes even more significant because he does not need to change his public image. He can continue being the respected businessman and devoted father while hiding an entirely different reality underneath. And this dual identity becomes one of the film's strongest psychological elements, because Vic is simultaneously a loving father, a successful professional, a husband who desperately wants his family to stay together, and a man who has committed terrible acts to maintain control. And these identities exist together rather than replacing one another, making him difficult to understand. And Melinda faces a similar contradiction because she can be affectionate toward her daughter and still engage in reckless relationships. She can resent Vic and still protect him, and she can fear his violence while also feeling attracted to the certainty it represents. And this complexity makes the ending intentionally uncomfortable because the audience is not given an easy character to support. Instead, we are asked to watch two deeply flawed people make choices that have consequences for everyone around them. And one of the most interesting elements is the role of Trixie, because her innocence contrasts with the darkness of her parents' relationship, and she does not fully understand the secrets surrounding them, but she can sense the emotional tension, and her love for both parents creates an additional reason for them to remain together even when their marriage is clearly unhealthy. And this means that their decisions are never completely private because their daughter will eventually have to live with the consequences of everything they have done. And this adds another layer of tragedy to the story, because Vic believes he is protecting his family, yet the methods he uses to protect it could ultimately create the greatest danger to that family. And Melinda's decision to remain silent may preserve the household in the short term, but it also means accepting a marriage built around a terrible secret, and this raises the question of whether survival is the same thing as happiness. And Deepwater never provides a simple answer, because its ending suggests that people can become comfortable inside unhealthy situations when those situations satisfy certain emotional needs. And for Vic and Melinda, their relationship may finally feel more honest precisely because they have stopped pretending that their marriage is normal. And this is why their final interactions carry such a strange emotional weight, because there is a new understanding between them. But that understanding has come at an enormous cost. And Vic no longer has to wonder whether Melinda will expose him, while Melinda no longer has to wonder whether Vic truly cares about her. And both have gained certainty, but the certainty is deeply disturbing, and the film's psychological tension therefore shifts from what will Vic do to what will these two people become now that they know the truth about each other. And that question is more complicated because the danger has not necessarily disappeared. It may simply have changed form. And if Melinda continues seeing other men, will Vic remain calm now that she knows what he is capable of? Or has their new understanding created a different set of rules? And if Vic believes that Melinda accepts his darker side, could that make him even more dangerous in the future? And these unanswered questions give the ending an intentionally ambiguous quality, because the movie does not suggest that their problems have been solved, only that they have reached a new equilibrium, and this equilibrium may last for a while. But it is built on unstable foundations, and that instability is exactly what makes the story memorable, because the final image of the couple together is not a conventional happy ending. It is the image of two people who have survived their own emotional war, but may have done so by becoming more comfortable with the darkness inside the relationship. And this is where the movie's title becomes even more meaningful, because Vic and Melinda have gone far below the surface of their marriage, and once they reach that depth, returning to ordinary life may no longer be possible. And the audience is left wondering whether the couple has finally found a strange form of understanding or simply accepted a dangerous cycle that could eventually destroy them. And from a broader perspective, Deep Water works as a psychological thriller because it refuses to make the conflict purely about murder. Instead, the murders become symptoms of a much larger problem, a marriage in which communication has been replaced by manipulation, jealousy has replaced trust, and love has become mixed with possession. And the film shows how quickly emotional games can become dangerous when neither person is willing to stop. And Vic's transformation is particularly disturbing because he begins the story as a man who appears passive but gradually becomes someone capable of controlling situations through fear, while Melinda begins as the person who appears to have all the freedom yet eventually becomes emotionally dependent on the very man she was trying to provoke. And this reversal gives the story its psychological power, because the characters do not simply change individually, they change each other, and every action one takes produces a reaction from the other, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. And as the final stage of the story approaches, it becomes clear that the biggest question is not whether Vic will be punished, because the movie deliberately avoids giving the audience a simple moral resolution. The bigger question is whether Vic and Melinda can continue living together after everything they now know, and the answer appears to be yes. But their continued relationship is based on a completely different understanding of marriage. One where secrets are accepted, violence is hidden, and emotional control has become part of intimacy. And this is what makes the conclusion so unsettling, because the family remains together, the house remains standing, and daily life appears to continue. Yet the audience knows that everything has changed, and every peaceful moment now carries the knowledge of what happened beneath the surface, and Vic's quiet smile no longer looks innocent, while Melinda's affection no longer looks simple, and even ordinary family moments become reminders that their happiness has been built around something deeply disturbing. And as we move toward the final part of the story, the remaining question is whether this fragile piece can survive, or whether the secrets they have chosen to protect will eventually rise back to the surface and destroy the family they are trying so desperately to preserve. By the final stage of Deep Water, the relationship between Vic and Melinda has completely transformed, because the marriage that once appeared to be slowly collapsing has somehow reached a strange and disturbing form of stability. But this stability is not built on forgiveness, trust, or honest communication. It is built on secrets, fear, attraction, and the knowledge that both husband and wife now understand the darker side of the other. And after Melinda discovers Tony's identification among Vic's possessions and realizes that her husband is almost certainly responsible for Tony's disappearance, she faces the most important decision of her life. Because she can expose Vic and potentially destroy their family, or she can remain silent and accept the reality of the man she married. And what makes her choice so complicated is that Vic has already become more than simply a husband to her, because after years of trying to provoke him, she has finally discovered that beneath his quiet personality there is an intense emotional attachment to her. And although that attachment has become twisted by jealousy and possessiveness, it is still powerful enough to make her reconsider everything she once believed about their marriage. And instead of turning Vic over to the authorities, Melinda chooses to protect him, burning the evidence that could connect him to Tony and effectively closing the door on the possibility of exposing the truth. And this decision tells us more about Melinda than any of her previous affairs ever could. because it shows that despite all the anger and frustration she has expressed toward Vic, she does not truly want to destroy him. And perhaps she never wanted to destroy their family either. Instead, she wanted to feel desired, noticed, and emotionally alive. And now that Vic has demonstrated just how deeply he is attached to her, she may finally feel that she has received the proof she was searching for, even though that proof has come in the most disturbing possible form. And Vic also changes because he no longer needs to pretend that he is simply tolerating Melinda's behavior. He knows she understands him, and that shared understanding creates a new kind of intimacy between them. Because both characters now know that there are things they cannot say openly, but they also know that the other person understands what those things mean. And this creates an almost silent agreement that their marriage will continue. But the audience is left questioning what kind of marriage this really is, because the normal rules have disappeared and the relationship is now based on a dangerous balance in which Vic knows that Melinda may continue testing him, while Melinda knows that Vic is capable of responding in ways she can no longer predict. And yet, instead of separating, they remain together, and that decision is perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story, because the movie does not present their reunion as a traditional romantic victory. It presents it as an acceptance of the darkness that has always existed beneath their relationship. And Vic's relationship with Trixie further complicates the ending, because despite everything he has done, he remains a caring father in his daughter's eyes, and Trixie continues to see him as someone she loves and trusts, which means that Vic's identity cannot be reduced to that of a simple villain, because he is capable of genuine affection and tenderness even while committing terrible acts. And this contradiction is central to understanding his character, because Vic believes that he is protecting his family, and from his perspective, removing the men who threaten his marriage may feel like restoring order. But the audience understands that his actions are morally indefensible, and the movie intentionally places these conflicting ideas next to each other without providing an easy answer, because a person can love his family and still cause terrible harm, and the existence of love does not erase the consequences of violence. And this is what makes Vic such an unsettling character, because he does not see himself as a monster. He sees himself as a husband and father trying to preserve the life he believes belongs to him. And that mindset is far more frightening than simple madness, because it means his violence is connected to a distorted sense of responsibility, and Melinda's decision to stay with him reinforces that distortion, because instead of forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions, she allows the secret to become part of their marriage. And by doing so, she becomes emotionally involved in protecting the very person she once feared. And this creates a relationship where both characters are now complicit in maintaining the appearance of normality, and the outside world sees a wealthy family continuing their life together, while only Vic and Melinda understand how much has changed. And this contrast between public appearance and private truth remains one of the strongest themes throughout the movie, because the Van Allens can attend social gatherings, spend time together, and raise their daughter while hiding the fact that their marriage has been shaped by death and deception. And the peaceful appearance of their lives therefore becomes almost ironic, because every ordinary moment carries the weight of everything that has happened. And Vic's calm personality now feels completely different from the beginning of the story, because at first his silence seemed like passivity, but by the end we understand that his silence can be a form of control, and he has learned that he does not need to openly fight Melinda to keep her. He simply needs to make her understand what he is capable of. And Melinda in turn appears to have accepted that reality, which means the power dynamic between them has reached a strange equilibrium. And this is where the film's title becomes especially meaningful, because deep water is not simply about danger beneath the surface, it is about how people can enter emotional territory so deep that returning to the surface becomes almost impossible. And Vic and Melinda have gone far beyond ordinary marital conflict. They have entered a space where love and fear exist together, where jealousy and attraction become connected, and where silence can communicate more than words. And the movie's final moments therefore feel deliberately ambiguous because we are not told exactly what their future will look like, but we can see that they have chosen to remain together, and that choice raises an important question. Has their marriage been saved, or have they simply accepted a dangerous new version of it? The answer depends on how we interpret their relationship. Because from one perspective, Melinda finally understands Vic, and Vic finally understands what Melinda needs, meaning that their marriage may have found a strange form of honesty. But from another perspective, they have simply stopped fighting the destructive cycle that brought them to this point, and instead of solving their problems, they have accepted them, and that makes their future uncertain. Because if Melinda begins another relationship, there is no guarantee that Vic will remain satisfied with silence. And if Vic feels threatened again, there is no guarantee that he will not respond with more violence, meaning that the danger has not truly disappeared. It has simply become part of the background of their lives. And this ambiguity is one of the reasons the story remains psychologically interesting even after the main conflict appears to be over, because the audience understands that the ending is not necessarily a happy one. It is simply an ending where the characters have made a choice, and that choice is to remain together despite everything. And the movie leaves us to decide whether that choice comes from love, fear, dependency, or some combination of all three. And perhaps the most tragic interpretation is that Vic and Melinda genuinely love each other but are incapable of expressing that love in a healthy way, because Vic's love becomes possessiveness, while Melinda's desire for freedom becomes emotional provocation, and both repeatedly hurt each other while still refusing to let go. And this makes their marriage feel less like a partnership and more like an addiction, because each person seems to need the other even when being together causes pain. And the deaths of the men around them become extreme consequences of that emotional dependency. And the movie therefore becomes a cautionary story about what can happen when jealousy is allowed to replace communication. Because Vic could have left, Melinda could have left, and they could have chosen completely different paths, but neither wanted to surrender the relationship, and their refusal to let go eventually pushed them into a situation where violence became part of their lives. And this is why the ending feels both quiet and disturbing, because there is no huge final explosion or dramatic confrontation that completely resolves everything. Instead, life continues, and that continuation is what makes the conclusion unsettling, because the characters have to live with what they have done, and the audience has to imagine what happens next. And Vic's greatest victory may not be that he eliminated his rivals, but that he managed to keep his family together. Yet, the price of that victory is enormous, because the family has survived physically while its emotional foundation has become deeply damaged. And Melinda's greatest decision is not simply staying with Vic, but choosing to participate in the silence that protects him. By doing so, she becomes part of the secret that defines their future, and Trixie remains innocent of the full truth, which creates an uncomfortable contrast between the child's view of her parents and the reality the audience understands. Because she sees a family that is still together, while the audience sees a family built around a secret that could destroy everything if it ever comes to light. And this contrast reinforces the idea that appearances can be extremely deceptive, especially in wealthy and comfortable environments where people often assume that success means happiness. And the Van Allen household looks successful from the outside, but emotionally it is anything but ordinary. And the final message of the story can therefore be understood as a warning about the danger of treating relationships like games. Because once people begin using jealousy, manipulation, and emotional punishment to communicate, the consequences can become impossible to control. And Vic and Melinda both contribute to the destruction of their own relationship, even though neither initially intends for it to become violent. And by the time they understand what they have created, they are already too deeply involved to simply walk away. And the movie's psychological power comes from making the audience question who is truly responsible for the situation. Because Vic commits the violence, but Melinda repeatedly creates situations designed to provoke him. And yet, provocation can never justify murder, meaning that the ultimate responsibility for Vic's actions remains with Vic himself. And this distinction is important because the story should not be interpreted as saying that Melinda caused the violence. Rather, it shows how a toxic relationship can create an environment where both people make increasingly destructive choices. And Vic ultimately chooses to cross the line, and once he does, he becomes responsible for the consequences of that choice. And Melinda then chooses to protect him, creating another moral decision that changes her character. And this chain of choices is what drives the story toward its unsettling conclusion. And by the time the final scenes arrive, the audience understands that the real mystery was never simply whether Vic was capable of murder. The deeper mystery was why two people who clearly had the opportunity to leave each other continued choosing the relationship despite everything. And the answer may be that love itself is not always enough to create a healthy relationship. Because love without trust can become jealousy, love without boundaries can become possession, and love without communication can become manipulation. And Vic and Melinda represent all three of these dangers, and yet they remain emotionally connected because beneath the conflict there is still a genuine bond that neither of them wants to lose. And that is what makes their story tragic rather than simply evil. Because the audience can see that these people might have had a completely different life if they had dealt with their problems honestly. But instead, they chose secrecy, provocation, and control. And those choices gradually changed them. And in the final analysis, Deep Water is less about a perfect villain and a perfect victim, and more about two deeply flawed people trapped inside a marriage that has become psychologically dangerous. And the movie leaves us with the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the most dangerous relationships are not the ones where people stop caring about each other, but the ones where they care so intensely that they are willing to hurt one another rather than let go. And Vic and Melinda's decision to remain together, therefore, feels less like a happy ending and more like the beginning of another chapter. Because the secrets are still there, the jealousy has not disappeared, and the emotional patterns that created the violence have not truly been repaired. And as the surface of their lives returns to normal, the darkness remains underneath, waiting. And that final idea perfectly captures the spirit of Deep Water. Everything may look peaceful from above, but once you understand what is happening below the surface, you realize that the deepest waters are often the most dangerous.